today's part with the following interruption for a public service announcement.
Welcome to Investing in Intelligence, where we talk about artificial intelligence companies, stocks, and trading using the most advanced AI models in the world. For this particular episode, we used about 3 million AI tokens from those models for the research. Just a reminder that nothing we say on this show is an endorsement to make a trade or buy or sell anything. It's just personal opinions. So where do we stand in relation to the war with Iran? Not good. We started the war, literally our first action in the war was bombing a school and killing 150 children. We then proceeded to bomb and destroy much of Iran's conventional military assets, the only problem being that Iran is not a conventional military power. They are a terrorist state, and they've successfully bombed 14 merchant ships, not to mention all their successful strikes on U.S. bases and allied nations. Over 13 nations are now involved. Israel killed the supreme leader of Iran, and then his son immediately was appointed to take over. In addition to the damage we've taken from the enemy, Kuwait shot down 3 of our fighter jets. Yesterday, a laundry room in the USS Gerald Ford, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, caught on fire. Of course, the part that is most embarrassing for the U.S. is how the administration and even the military failed to adequately plan to keep the Strait of Hormuz open during this conflict. Priority number 1 of the conflict should have been to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, and every other priority of the war should have been secondary. To save the day, our government offered up to $20 billion in reinsurance for ships trying to travel the Strait of Hormuz, and then Bank of America informed us that about $352 billion is the amount of insurance that is actually needed. But regardless of how good your car insurance is, would you be willing to drive your car through the middle of a huge shootout between the police and the mafia? Probably not. When we started this conflict, I heard the age-old saying ring aloud again: you always buy when bombs start to fly. And it's actually true that military conflicts as a single variable don't necessarily harm the U.S. economy and may even be slightly good for the U.S. stock market. The Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ukraine wars haven't necessarily been bad for the U.S. economy. That being said, war-induced oil shocks have never been good for stocks. Almost every one in history has led to economic recession. That's why when Sunday night the price of oil jumped to $130 a barrel, the next day Trump came out and made several statements indicating many of the war goals were complete, and stocks surged. It was the classic taco. Trump always chickens out. But what happens when the taco has no meat? You see, this isn't Venezuela. The enemy is actually fighting back. The US has a roughly 0% success rate in Middle Eastern wars, and a big part of the reason is because the enemy is willing to fight longer and harder, practically forever, with guerrilla or terroristic tactics. Oh yeah, and Iran is a significantly more capable enemy than were the forces we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a metaphor for this situation, and that metaphor is tariffs. Last year, the US put huge tariffs on China just to realize that China had control over our supply of critical minerals, something that we can't live without. So we had to pull way back and negotiate for our own survival. Iran has control over the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil passes, 20% of natural gas and jet fuel, 30% of global fertilizer, 50% of global urea, 30% of global ammonia, 45% of global sulfur, and 40% of global helium, which is critical for data centers, semiconductor manufacturing, and even MRI machines. This supply shock is equal to or worse than the outrageous tariffs we put onto China and other countries early last year. But the difference is that we could easily take those tariffs off, but it takes 2 nations to stop a war. Even if we gassed up all our warships and sailed away tomorrow, what's to stop Iran from bombing any and every oil tanker that tries to pass through the Strait of Hormuz? Actually, here's a quote from the Iranian military a couple days ago. Get ready for oil to be $200 a barrel, because the oil price depends on regional security, which you have destabilized. That quote was attributed to Ibrahim Zolfikari, who Reuters stated was a spokesperson for Iran's military command. But it's problematic that there doesn't really seem to be any unified military command or even unified political leadership at this point. Some conjectured that the long statement by the supreme leader released yesterday might not have even been from him at all. It's not entirely clear at this point that the US could negotiate with anyone in Iran who has control of all the splintered elements capable of violence. Let me just paint the picture here. Iran has a massive land front on the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is a narrow body of water about 100 miles wide that separates all of Iran's shores from the shores of a bunch of Arab nations, like the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, all of which Iran has successfully bombed in the past week. We have roughly 3% of the American military in the region, but get this, they're not even in the Persian Gulf, because it is too dangerous to even get there. Anything exiting or entering the Persian Gulf must navigate the 21-mile wide choke point separating Oman and Iran that is the Strait of Hormuz. So we have 90% of 3% of the US military sitting too far from most of the Arab nations and their cargo ships and oil tankers to even realistically protect them, because it's too dangerous for us to even get close to them. And here is the craziest part of all. Iran has exported over 12 million barrels of crude oil through the waterways I just mentioned since the war began. All of them were headed for China. So there's a company called Tanker Trackers. They use satellite imagery to track vessels rather than their transponders, which can be turned off. About half of these tankers they're tracking left Iran and were openly flying the Iranian flag. In other words, Iran has stopped everyone else from exporting oil, but it's still business as usual for them. Actually, it's better business because the price of oil is way higher, so they're making even more money. Now, we know Israel did bomb some oil storage facilities near Tehran, but the US condemned those actions, wasn't happy about it. And of course, we're allowing the oil to keep flowing since we don't want to further disrupt relations with China or further disrupt the oil market. And it's probably the only negotiating chip that we have with Iran. We could tell them that if they don't negotiate, we'll hit their oil industry, although, maybe they wouldn't even believe us. But look, I know I've painted a pretty bleak picture here, but we do have that one negotiating chip. And we could use it to negotiate a ceasefire in a week or 2 weeks or a month, which would be net positive for global oil markets. If we're unable to negotiate a ceasefire, and Iran continues its strikes on Middle Eastern nations and vessels in the Persian Gulf, then we don't really have any choice but to invade Iran. Seriously, we don't have any choice but to do a full invasion if they're holding up everyone's oil exports except for theirs. We have no choice. Right now, economists are mostly saying we've got 1 to 2 more months of oil prices above $80 to $90 before it starts to lead to severe economic consequences and likely recession.
You lose 20% of supplies, you get a multiplier of 4, that's an 80% increase in prices. From a pre-war price of around $60 per barrel, that takes you to $108 per barrel. So that is our first thing. And this is where we are now. There is a lot of intensity in the war that is closing the Strait of Hormuz. But it's no longer a question about intensity. It's now a question about duration. It's no longer about, are we going to get negative number of ships going through Hormuz? It is 0. No, that's not going to happen. It's a question of how long will Hormuz be shut. And that's what our latest piece was about. It's about modeling duration. What happens if Hormuz is shut for 1 month, for 2 months, or 3 months?
And what was your worst case scenario there in all of that modeling?
Well, obviously, if it's shut for 3 months, so you get a higher price. So you get a price of around $164 per barrel.
But don't forget the stock market is forward-looking. So if, 3 weeks from now, we have no resolution and oil prices are still over $90 a barrel, then expect an impending bear market. Expect the stock market to, not a term I use very often on the show, but crash. Interestingly, a big ground invasion wouldn't necessarily be bad for global markets. It would be terrible for the Republican Party in the US, but they're already taking a huge hit from this conflict. So here at Investing in Intelligence, we monitor all sides of the media, everything from CNN, the New York Times, Fox News, the Daily Wire, even some of the more radical elements. Here's 2 of the most radical elements of the far right speaking about this war. These guys are so radical that I'm afraid to even say their names on this podcast. Let it suffice to say that their initials are AJ and NF. And if you know, you know.
What the hell's going on here?
I think you have to vote Democrat in 26, and I'll tell you why. I mean, we're being told always that the Republicans are the lesser of 2 evils, that, they're going to be marginally better than the Democrats. Look at all of the broken promises. We're in a regime change war with Iran. You've been around. I've been around not as long as you, but for some time. Regime change in Iran is like synonymous with the neocons' ultimate master plan. That is like the number one thing on Israel's wish list.
On the crown. It was the whole Middle East strategy and the Rebuilding America's Defenses PNAC plan 2020 or 2000 was this.
Yes, and even further than that, going back to clean break in 96, this has always been the plan. And for a time, we thought that was unthinkable. We thought that Trump winning made that impossible. So for Trump to be the one to take us there and sell it and push it and trigger it, and now we're in a regime change war with Iran, it's almost unbelievable to even say that. Thousands of American and Israeli airstrikes destroying Iran's military. Here's how I feel about it. If you will tolerate that, you will tolerate anything. At what point do you say no? At what point do you say there's no excuses? People say, well, if there's boots on the ground, dude, they're dropping bombs everywhere. And it's in Iran. So for me, I said, that's the last straw. I'm out. And you know me, I'm the furthest thing from a Democrat. I'm far right. I'm not left wing or even liberal.
So there you heard it straight from the horse's mouth. Republicans are losing the far right over this war. Now, granted, some Trump loyalists are still in line. Mainstream conservative media is still in line, and pro-Israel elements like the Daily Wire are still massively in line. And even some from the other side of the aisle, like John Fetterman, are also in line. So why have I spent so much time talking about this war? Because this isn't a war podcast or a politics podcast. It's an AI investing podcast. It's because there are times in the stock market where everything just comes down to one issue. And that issue is now the Strait of Hormuz. So the US now has to desperately negotiate an end to the war we are not really winning, or we will have to do a ground invasion in less than 2 months. I would say there's only a 1% chance one of those two outcomes doesn't happen. So that would mean there's like a 99% chance the stock market can stabilize, since oil prices won't be stuck above $90 a gallon all year. Remember, the stock market can do well with either Democrats or Republicans in power, and the stock market can do well while we're in the middle of a war. It just can't do well with an oil shock that goes on forever. As long as we either negotiate a ceasefire or do a ground invasion, there won't be an oil shock. So let's focus on the more positive of those outcomes, and imagine a week or two from now, Israel does a precision strike and kills the current leader, the son of the previous leader, and some new person comes in and they negotiate a ceasefire with the US and Israel. Yes, at that point, all the AI stocks we've been telling you about for years now will go up, which means if they sink more between now and when that resolution inevitably comes, feel free to buy. But I also want to talk about what will go down when that resolution comes. You see, if we get a ceasefire, defense stocks that have run up will start to pull back. They're kind of pulling back already. Although ITA, the defense sector ETF, is up 60% over the last year, as people gradually have realized that Trump isn't really a peaceful president. But a ceasefire in Iran might be an opportunity for an even bigger pullback, like I'm thinking maybe 15-20%. And that would be a buying opportunity. So we know that Iran has already used up a lot of their large missiles, and more importantly, a lot of their missile launchers have been taken out, but it's believed that they have a much larger supply of drones. The US made two huge mistakes in this conflict. Mistake number one, as we've already discussed, was not adequately planning to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. But number two was not adequately planning for a war against the East's largest producer of medium-sized drones. You see, Iran is an exporter of drones to other conflicts. When the Ethiopian government needed to push back a group of rebels attempting to take over its capital in late 2021, it did so with Iranian drones. Iran has also supplied drones to conflicts in Sudan, Yemen, and of course, Russia-Ukraine. Iran is a powerhouse in drones. Iran bombed its first oil tanker in this conflict with a drone boat, and yesterday we heard about two more similar attacks. But let's forget about the drone boats for a second and consider drones and missiles in the air. There are a few systems to protect against missiles and drones, including the Patriot missile, the Iron Dome, and a higher elevation system called the THAAD. If you've ever heard someone say that we use $2 million missiles to shoot down $20,000 drones, in that case they're referring to the Patriot missile system, which is made by both RTX Corporation and Lockheed Martin, both of which are publicly traded companies. The Patriots are our primary mechanism for taking down incoming threats like drones or lower flying missiles, while the THAAD system is for missiles flying at higher elevations. So the most logical question that you might be asking is, why doesn't the US use the Iron Dome system to protect its military bases and ships, since it only costs $40,000 per shot instead of $2 million? Here's where it gets interesting. The Iron Dome system is primarily made by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aerospace Industries, both of which are owned by the Israeli government. The US Army actually did buy 2 Iron Dome batteries back in 2019 to test them out for base defense, but things didn't really work out. You see, the US military has a strict doctrine. Every single radar, missile launcher, and command center must be able to digitally talk to one another in a unified network called the Integrated Battle Command System, IBCS. When the US Army bought its 2 Iron Dome batteries, they asked Israel for the underlying software source code so they could plug the Iron Dome into IBCS. Israel refused, and that was the end of us using the Iron Dome. It's okay though, because we do have similar products including CRAM, CDOME, Coyote, Phalanx, and Aegis, which are wholly made by RTX and Lockheed Martin once again. Now, a couple days ago I checked our holdings and it looks like we bought RTX in November of 2024 and July of 2025, so we're up about 42% overall. And we just bought Lockheed Martin stock a couple weeks ago, so late to the game on that one. By the way, there's one other new system the US military is using to shoot down cruise missiles and large drones. The system is called Enduring Shield, and it's made by Leidos, ticker symbol LDOS. It looks like we bought Leidos in November of 2025, and we're down 10% since then. We're not selling though. We're not selling any of these, and here's why.
It's very important to stress that the United States never at any point had enough munitions to address the threat coming from People's Republic of China, which is the pacing threat and has been identified formally as a pacing threat for the past 6 years or so, and arguably much longer than that. I mean, President Obama announced the sort of pivot to the Pacific in the middle of his presidency. So it's been a while that the United States has been really looking at China more than Russia as being the threat that they have to focus on. And so the United States, whether it's air defense interceptors or offensive weapons, the United States, their inventories have at no point been sufficient to deal with this. So there's a lot of people who want to say that, oh, well, because of the war in Ukraine or because of the wars in the Middle East now and the United States supporting Israel, now we don't have enough. They didn't have enough to begin with. So what we're witnessing in the Middle East right now, and previously in Ukraine with the support that was provided to them, that didn't change the calculus at all because there wasn't enough to begin with, and now, there's a little bit less now. But what has happened is that finally some of the policymakers are waking up to this problem because the professionals in the military have been warning about this for a long time, that like, hey, these are our unfunded requirements. We need to have more. We need to have this, and this. And it just hasn't been getting funded. And now finally there's a realization that, oh, you know what? Yeah, we actually don't have enough. They want to take production from last year. Lockheed Martin built 620 interceptors, and they want to take that production to 2,000 interceptors every year. So over 300% increase in production capacity. So that's quite dramatic. Whereas if you compare what the Biden administration was doing, like it increased by, a few hundred missiles per year, basically. They were in the 300 or 400 range somewhere. I'd have to go back and double check where it was annually at the outset of the war in Ukraine. And they made some pretty modest investments to increase that. So the Trump administration is taking a much more dramatic view of what's necessary. So they've got that deal signed with or framework agreement. We're still waiting on that contract to be definitized, but between the base budget defense appropriations and the reconciliation bill that was passed, there's a good amount of money to get started on that. More money is going to be necessary, and there's conversations happening today. Actually, there's supposed to be a meeting at the White House, and we might have a new defense supplemental released today, $50 billion to help fund all these contracts. So that deal was announced a couple months back now. I think it was January. Not long after that, they also announced the deal for THAAD interceptors as well. So they want to take that and do a 400% increase. They want to be able to make around 400 per year. Now it's 96 per year. Want to take it to around 400 per year. So even bigger increase for that. They've also signed a framework deal with Raytheon for a bunch of different munitions that they make. So when we look at defensive missiles, not really missile defense is actually an offensive weapon, but we won't get into that now. That can be a separate conversation if we want to get into that. But looking at missile defense, Standard Missile 3 and Standard Missile 6, looking at increasing production capacity for those. SM6 again 400%. They want to take it from 125 per year to 500 per year. For the other munitions, they're looking at around maybe doubling them or 3 times, 4 times. For SM3, Tomahawk, AMRAAM, these are all getting they're all planning substantial production capacity increases for these missiles.
So the money is coming, and we know a lot of that money is going to RTX and Lockheed Martin. While their stocks are up 35% over the last 6 months, considering we have 3 years of Trump left, maybe their stocks should be up even more. But even if a ceasefire comes in the Iran conflict, keep in mind the Arab nations have realized how vulnerable they are and will now be ordering more of these systems. Even if we install the most perfect new Iranian leader, no one knows if they'll last. The horse has left the barn. Everyone's going to want more of these defense systems now. You know what's interesting? I never mentioned AeroVironment. We've been buying and selling AVAV since 2024, and the stock has been bipolar and really hasn't done much of anything over the last 2 years. Kind of reminds me of Rivian stock, if you know what I mean. Hopefully you don't know what I mean. Anyways, AeroVironment makes a laser system that shoots down drones, including 500-pound Class 3 drones like Iran's Shahed drones. Problem is that it doesn't work in all weather conditions or at long ranges. I wouldn't say they have all the glitches sorted out either, considering an AeroVironment laser just accidentally shot down a Customs and Border Patrol drone in Southwest Texas a few weeks ago. There's a bit of confusion around what's going on in Southwest Texas, but there are confirmed reports that the U.S. military has loaned its AeroVironment directed energy drone defense systems to federal agencies operating in that area. The cool thing is, AeroVironment has a new system it's developing that uses a cheap missile to take down an incoming threat if their laser is unable to do so. They won a $96 million contract for that system in late 2025. That was not that long ago, so they're really not quite on the front lines yet. March 10th, AeroVironment was down 9% after hours for missing on revenue and EPS and guidance. Do we really want to keep owning a stock that misses on EPS and revenue and guidance? We usually don't, unless it's a really, really long-term play. For example, you can kind of think of AeroVironment as a Tesla type of situation here. It's a little bit of a longer play, but you kind of want to have some in pocket before the market starts to catch wind of the upswing that will come. Oh, by the way, since this is an AI podcast, let me scratch your AI itch real quick. To shoot down drones flying in for an attack, AeroVironment uses a proprietary AI targeting software called Wizard. AeroVironment also makes offensive solutions, including switchback drones powered by an AI that analyzes live video feeds on the fly. AeroVironment's AI scans the battlefield, autonomously tells the difference between an enemy tank, a civilian truck, and a soldier, and then locks onto the target. They also have higher-level AI programs that control multiple drones and even analyze the battlefield as a whole, especially an AI system called Cortex. By the way, you might have heard something in the news about this Iran conflict being the first time the U.S. has used a long-range drone swarm against an adversary. Here's Admiral Brad Cooper describing how he did that with technology stolen from Iran.
Lucas, indispensable. As many of you know, and if you don't know, this was an original Iranian drone design. We captured it, pulled the guts out, sent it back to America, put a little Made America on it, brought it back here, and we're shooting it at the Iranians. To
me, it's kind of funny that a company like RTX or Lockheed Martin couldn't make something like this. And what's cool is that when the US government captured Iran's drone unicorn, they didn't give it to RTX or Lockheed Martin. With the massive overhead, bloated supply chains, and bureaucratic red tape of those companies, the US government knew that RTX and Lockheed Martin would struggle to cheaply and quickly develop their Shahed. So instead, the US government took it to a small startup in Arizona called SpectreWorks. Why SpectreWorks? Because SpectreWorks had already built a product called the FLM-136, which was a threat emulation target drone, literally a reverse engineered copy of the Iranian Shahed that they built so US troops could practice shooting them down in training exercises. In other words, they'd already made a clone of what they can now make the real thing. Sadly, SpectreWorks is not a publicly traded company, but it's okay, since the US government actually owns the IP for their Shahed drone, also known as the Lucas. So if the US government suddenly decided to purchase $100 million of Lucas drones, it wouldn't necessarily be SpectreWorks who makes them. It could be AeroVironment, or Anduril, or RedCat, whose stock RCAT is up 1,800% over the last 2 years. If you want to own some of AI defense unicorn Anduril, You might even get an IPO in the next year or so. But even before then, there's a closed-end fund that was supposed to launch on March 9th that holds Anduril. It's called VCX, and it's from a company called Fundrise. Fundrise didn't give a reason for why they delayed the launch that was supposed to happen last Monday, but it's likely related to overall market volatility, the war, and also Robinhood's most recent failed closed-end fund launch. So Robinhood just launched RVIN, and I think it's down like 10-15% as of today. But I don't really like RVIN. The only useful thing that I see, and probably other people see in it, is Databricks. So even the Epic DXYZ that we have an episode on from like 2 years ago, maybe 2 episodes we have, even that has SpaceX, Shield AI, XAI, and OpenAI. If you're really eager to own some of these amazing private companies before they IPO, you could even pick up some DXYZ right now. I think it's at a 30% premium to NAV, which isn't too terribly bad. Or keep your eyes peeled for the VCX launch, which would be a great deal if it pulled back. We just don't know when and if it's going to launch at this point. So far, the Iran war is an air war. If it does become a ground war, the first troops in will be special forces, who rely heavily on devices by L3 Harris and Elbit, both of which are publicly traded companies. We first bought L3 Harris in early July of 2025, and we're up 39% since then. We bought Elbit at about the same time, and we're up 92% on our Elbit. So I think you're starting to see why we're talking about this stuff. We've identified some of the companies that are critical right now. And of course, we left out Palantir since we've already done a full episode on Palantir previously. Keep in mind, though, that AI and humanoid robots will be more and more critical in warfare over the coming decades. Right now, we're in this interesting place where companies like Anthropic are making a big public stand to say that AI should never strike a target without human input. I was going to say that they kind of remind me of the samurais insisting on using their swords, but after doing some AI research on that, it's actually a historical fallacy that the ancient samurai didn't want to use firearms and they thought that a sword in battle was more honorable. That's not even true. In actuality, they thought winning was most honorable, so they adopted firearms almost instantly and had fought as archers for centuries even before guns came along. You see, this whole idea of not using AI to target humans is kind of a San Francisco liberal elite fad rather than a reality of future warfare. If 20 years from now China has a force of 1 million humanoid robots that can eliminate targets using only AI, do you really think we would force our robots to get human clearance for every use of force? Obviously no, because that would mean certain defeat and the end of our civilization. As seen in comments by the Department of War related to Anthropic's recent massive show of virtue, the US government will get what AI it needs one way or another. And sources indicate that XAI, which is now a division of SpaceX, openly offered AI models to the US government for all uses allowed under US law. By the way, if we can move past this oil shock over the next couple months like I predict, plan for a SpaceX IPO later this year. SpaceX's Starlink service is already critical in military conflicts and will only become more important. So it's an absolute buy from a defense AI angle. And of course, Tesla is the company best positioned to manufacture humanoid robots at scale, which will be weaponized. I recently saw a video on YouTube showing that not only China is weaponizing their robots now, there's actually a firm in the US that's making humanoid robots specifically for combat. But yeah, Tesla is probably even better suited for that. So Tesla is a must-buy for the humanoid robot revolution coming over the next 2 decades. We also think Garmin will provide future technology that goes into much of the land-based robotic warfighter. Garmin already supplies critical components used by drones and jets made by contractors Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. Garmin stock isn't up quite as much as some of the other companies we've discussed, which might be in part because it's a Swiss company rather than an American one. It's a great company though, and since their shares are only traded in the US, you don't have to worry about the downsides of an ADR. In closing, I should mention that there are those who believe the greatest weaponry of all will ultimately be AI itself. But that may not mean the model makers keep all that value for themselves. Here's Jeremy Harris, an extremely distinguished AI safety consultant. So he's an actual safety consultant, meaning he works with the US military, he works with the US government. He even has consulted with special forces in the US regarding threats to our AI data centers. He's not some researcher who just spouts off theories on Twitter.
At the end of the day, how much damage this does to Anthropic does depend on what you think the likely future of AI looks like. Look, if you think that AI is going to become, as I do, a weapon of mass destruction, if you think it's well on its way there, then at some time not too far in the distant future, there will be talk of nationalizing the AI labs in some form. It may be a full-on nationalization. I think there are huge problems with how you would actually implement that and the efficiency of what you got. Like, it's not obvious what it means to nationalize these labs, but in some way to basically say, look, you are basically making WMDs, so we're going to find a way to force you to produce stuff, whether using the DPA, the Defense Production Act, or otherwise. So if you live in that world, it's quite possible that the DOW basically just does not include Anthropic in that process and essentially cuts them out of whatever interventions they plan on doing to secure American leadership on AI and basically stabilize the world or whatever. I mean, it sounds like science fiction, but I think it's kind of like the default path we're headed for.
In closing, we should all acknowledge the fact that war is inevitable. Over the last 100 years, the longest the US has gone without being in a major conflict is 17 years, from the end of the Vietnam War to the beginning of Desert Storm. But even during those 17 years, we had the invasion of Grenada, the bombing of Libya, and the invasion of Panama. In other words, war is a good business to invest in. Defense companies often have lumpy earnings that can lead to stock volatility, so it's not a sector for the impatient investor. The long-term investor, on the other hand, is well suited to capitalize on an increasingly intelligent future of defense. Oh, excuse me, I misspoke. The US no longer deals in the Department of Defense. We're now in the department and the business of war. All right, so that was the end of the episode, which was recorded yesterday, and we were about to hit the publish button, and then it was announced that the US has just bombed an island off the coast of Iran, which is their big transit island for all of their oil exports. Now, the interesting part is that they hit some different defense capabilities on that island, but did not touch the actual oil facilities. This is exactly what I predicted earlier in this episode, which is that the US is going to try to use the ability to take out Iran's oil facilities and oil economy as a bargaining chip. So literally what we predicted early in this episode coming true right as we're about to publish this episode. Keep an eye on those efforts. Those efforts are the only thing that can actually bring this conflict to a close. If that bargaining chip fails, once again, it looks like we're probably going for some kind of a ground invasion, which will be extraordinarily difficult considering not just the geography of Iran, but especially the well-protected location of the capital, Tehran. Thanks for listening to our show. Please be sure to like and subscribe and tune in next time for our discussion of more AI stocks and more AI-related issues.
First revolution is when you change your mind about how you look at things and see that there might be another way to look at it that you have not been shown. You will not be able to stay home. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and pop out. The revolution will not be televised, and be no rerun, brothers and sisters. The revolution will be live.